In 378 AD, the Roman Empire is under threat from the Goths, a massive barbarian horde which has crossed the Danube and swamped Roman territory. 25,000 Roman infantry would meet the invaders here, in Turkey, at Adrianople. The Goths' numbers were growing all the time as other refugee tribes joined them. Tribes such as the Alans, with large numbers of cavalry, and the Huns. Like a plague of locusts, the refugees were stripping the land. Finally, they reached the great city of Adrianople. Their first attack on the city failed. Fritigern realized that without siege equipment, he would never capture the city and pulled his forces back. He also knew that while the Roman army had been in decline, it was still a formidable force.
Valens begins to prepare immediately to confront this force. The next day, at about dawn, he marches out. This time he marches out in battle order, with the cavalry in the front, infantry in the middle, cavalry at the back, out the road.
The Roman Emperor Valens had 15,000 to 20,000 men under his command. He marched to meet the Goths outside Adrianople. At the same time, his nephew Gratian left Italy with a small army. The plan was that he and Valens would join forces and together drive the Goths back across the frontier. Valens camped outside Adrianople and sent his scouts on ahead to spy on the Goths. They rode back with surprising news. This was no vast barbarian horde. They reckoned that Fritigern had no more than 10,000 men. Valens already outnumbered them by at least 5,000. Valens had to make a quick decision. If he attacked now, he would stand a good chance against a small force. His battle-hardened legions would scatter the poorly disciplined tribesmen. And there was another attraction. If he won the battle now, he wouldn't have to share the glory of victory with Gratian.
My guess is that the Emperor Valens actually had an abiding jealousy of his nephew.
A group of Valens' generals urged him to attack, but his cavalry commander urged him to wait for Gratian. And in a letter, Gratian himself warned Valens to wait a short time.
We have the classic situation in which Valens receives a message from Gratian which says, "Please wait in dealing with the problem because I'm coming to help."
While the argument raged, Fritigern sent a Christian priest with an offer of peace in exchange for land for the Goths. It may have been a genuine offer, or he may have been stalling for time, waiting for reinforcements. But Valens decided to fight.
Worst possible solution was simply to confront the Goths himself with a single army in a way that favored the enemy tactically, and that's what he did. It was because he was jealous and wanted the glory for himself.
August 9th, 378 was a blisteringly hot day. Valens left his baggage train and the imperial treasure inside the walls of Adrianople and marched at the head of his army to meet the Goths. The Goths were a people on the move. Families, women, children, slaves, and captives. When traveling, their baggage train alone stretched 6 miles. Now, as they prepared for battle, the Goths made good use of these wagons. They drew them up in a circle, like the early Western settlers in the United States, who drew their wagons into a circle to defend against attacking Indians.
Nomadic people travels, civilian and soldier alike. And in the evening, they circle the wagons and they yoke the tongue of the wagon with one another, and therefore they can create a de facto fortified position very quickly and instantaneously in a way that even the Roman army could not. It gave impetus to the soldier to fight with the idea that if he lost, he wouldn't just lose the battle, but he would lose his livelihood, maybe his family. So it was a very effective concept.
The Goths only used the wagon circle as a fallback position. They preferred to fight in the open, on the plain, with plenty of room to maneuver. The Roman army which faced the Goths still resembled the army of Julius Caesar and the Rome of 400 years earlier.
The troops at the Battle of Adrianople were basically your standard infantry of the late Roman Empire. They would have been armed with weapons that Julius Caesar would have recognized, but they would have been different. The shield was a different shape, the sword was a bit longer, the armor was essentially the same as in the days of Julius Caesar.
Fritigern moved his troops into formation, well out in front of the wagon circle. But he had no intention of fighting. He was playing for time and preparing a trap for his Roman enemies. (378 AD). In what is now Turkey, the legions of Rome's Eastern Empire are fighting to save their land from invasion by the Goths. The two armies faced each other outside the walls of Adrianople. But the Goth leader Fritigern was determined to keep Rome waiting. He was playing for time as large numbers of his cavalry were scattered, foraging for grass and food.
This was August in the Balkans. There's nothing to eat for horses. They were in the nearby ravines, pasturing their horses.
This was why the Roman scouts had seen few cavalry and underestimated the Goth numbers at only 10,000. When the outlying cavalry returned to the army, its numbers would swell by thousands more. Fritigern stalled by once again sending an envoy to Valens, pretending that he wanted to open peace negotiations. While the coming and going continued, the Roman soldiers stood around in the burning heat. Why Valens bothered with negotiations is anybody's guess. Perhaps he realized the Goth army was bigger than he thought. But then without warning, the battle began. An elite Roman cavalry unit and a band of archers had been skirmishing with the Goth right wing. The Roman skirmishers were troops who moved out in front of the main force, probing the enemy line for weaknesses. But they chose to attack just as Fritigern's cavalry reinforcements arrived. The skirmish became a full-blown battle.
Gothic cavalry was nomadic, and that would mean that although the horses themselves would not be as large or as well protected as Central European horses and cavalrymen, they would be more mobile.
Fritigern's new cavalry cut through the skirmishers and sent them into headlong retreat. The battle had started so suddenly that the Romans were still getting into formation.
Valens had marched for a number of hours that day. It was hot. His men had no water. If he had have stopped, assembled his army in a uniform manner, then he probably would have had a lot better luck.
An 8-mile march means, of course, that his army arrives relatively tired. They're hungry. It's a very hot day. By the time they get there, it's gone midday.
Sensing weakness, Fritigern launched a cavalry attack along the entire Roman line. There was chaos in the ranks. The whole Roman army seemed to be in retreat, but then slowly began to rally as soldiers shouted encouragement to one another. The fighting spread like wildfire, with thousands of arrows and javelins raining down on the Roman ranks. The Goths held their formation, But the Roman army began to disintegrate into separate fighting units.
They had the big disadvantage that they were surrounded, and they were hot.
The retreating Roman horsemen raced back through their own ranks, causing panic among the remaining cavalry, most of which galloped away. Fritigern's infantry was drawn up in great columns. Now they charged headlong and smashed into the Roman ranks like human battering rams. Hand-to-hand slaughter began.
The key to remember, they were an individual tribal force that put more emphasis on individual kills, individual prowess in battle, rather than marching in time, advancing on order.
A handful of Roman cavalry who remained on the left wing were forced back by the Goths and fled in confusion. With the Roman left flank now fully exposed, the Goth cavalry moved in. Without cavalry support, the Roman army was being pressed together on all sides.
The battle was at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. It was hot. It was 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Soldiers started at dawn, force marched, hadn't eaten, no noon meal, and they were surrounded and cut down.
A first-hand account about the last moments of the battle were recorded by the Roman officer and historian, Ammianus.
Dust arose in such clouds as to hide the sky, which rang with fearful shouts. In consequence, it was impossible to see the enemy's missiles in flight and dodge them. All found their mark and dealt death on every side. The barbarians poured on in huge columns, trampling down horse and man and crushing our ranks, so to make orderly retreat impossible.
Ammianus has a very vivid description of heads flying, limbs cut off, and the chaos, the dust, the panic, the shouting, the screaming of what happens when you have several thousand men who know they're going to die and there's no way out.
The slaughter was terrible. By the end of the battle, 2/3 of the Roman army, at least 10,000 men, had died. Among them was Valens.
The emperor died either on the battlefield or he got away a brief moment to a farmhouse nearby. That was set fire and he was cremated. And anyway, he didn't see the sunset on the 9th of August.
An emperor was dead, and the Goths were victorious. When Gratian heard of the defeat, he turned and headed back to his own Western Empire. But he could not turn his back on the Gothic threat. The victory at Adrianople showed other tribes that the Romans could be defeated and that there was land to be grabbed within the empire.
Valens begins to prepare immediately to confront this force. The next day, at about dawn, he marches out. This time he marches out in battle order, with the cavalry in the front, infantry in the middle, cavalry at the back, out the road.
The Roman Emperor Valens had 15 to 20. In 378 AD, the Roman Empire is under threat from the Goths, a massive barbarian horde which has crossed the Danube and swamped Roman territory. 25,000 Roman infantry would meet the invaders here, in Turkey, at Adrianople. The Goths' numbers were growing all the time as other refugee tribes joined them. Tribes such as the Alans, with large numbers of cavalry, and the Huns. Like a plague of locusts, the refugees were stripping the land. Finally, they reached the great city of Adrianople. 20,000 men under his command. He marched to meet the Goths outside Adrianople. At the same time, his nephew Gratian left Italy with a small army. The plan was that he and Valens would join forces and together drive the Goths back across the frontier. Their first attack on the city failed. Fritigern realized that without siege equipment, he would never capture the city and pulled his forces back. He also knew that while the Roman army had been in decline, it was still a formidable force.